Faith, Power, and Emancipation podcast. Today we are getting into episode 6, which is focused on chapter 5, the limits of liberation, revolution, utopianism, and the problem of power. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Faith, Power, and Emancipation. I'm your host and author, Professor Januarius Asongu. And I want to thank you once again for joining me as we continue our chapter by chapter journey through my book, Faith, Power, and Emancipation. In our last episode, we began with part 2 of the book, which was entitled Empire and the Crisis of Power. We examined how empire has changed in the 21st century. We saw that domination no longer operates primarily through military occupation or colonial administration. Increasingly, it works through economics, technology, digital platforms, surveillance, and the struggle to shape human consciousness itself. That discussion naturally leads us to today's chapter. If modern empire has become more sophisticated, how should people respond? Should they revolt? Should they seek revolution? Should they dismantle existing systems and begin afresh? History tells us that whenever oppression becomes unbearable, people eventually rise up. This has happened throughout human civilization, from the biblical Exodus to the French Revolution to the anti colonial struggles across Africa and Asia to the civil rights movement in the US and to the countless liberation movements around the world. The desire for freedom is one of the deepest aspirations of the human spirit. Indeed, I would argue that the longing for freedom reflects something fundamental about our creation in the image of God. We are not created for slavery, domination, or humiliation. We are created for dignity, truth, responsibility, and authentic human flourishing. Yet history also teaches us another lesson, one that is far more uncomfortable. Many revolutions succeed in overthrowing oppression, but far fewer succeed in building freedom. That simple observation lies in the heart of today's chapter. It is entitled The Limits of Liberation, Revolution, Utopianism, and the Problem of Power. Notice that I do not speak about the failure of liberation. I speak about its limit. That distinction is critically important. Throughout this book, I defend liberation. I believe Christians have a moral obligation to stand with the oppressed. I believe injustice should be confronted. I believe systems that deny human dignity should be challenged. I also believe something equally important, that liberation is only the beginning. Freedom is much harder than revolution. Why? Because removing the oppressor does not automatically remove the human temptation to dominate. This is perhaps one of the greatest lessons history offers us. Again and again, those who were once oppressed eventually become the new oppressors. Those who fought for justice sometimes construct new systems of injustice. Movements born in the name of freedom occasionally end up restricting freedom. Why does this happen? It is tempting to blame particular leaders. Sometimes that is certainly justified. But I believe the problem is deeper than individual personalities. The problem lies within our understanding of power itself. Too often, revolutionary movements assume that oppression exists because bad people occupy positions of authority. If only those people were removed, justice would naturally emerge. Unfortunately, reality is far more complicated. Power itself changes people, institutions shape behavior. Human beings remain morally fallible, regardless of which side of history they occupy. The oppressed do not automatically become virtuous simply because they have suffered, nor do the powerful become evil merely because they possess authority. Christian theology has always understood this. The doctrine of original sin reminds us that every human being is capable of both extraordinary goodness and profound moral failure. No revolution abolishes this reality. This is one of the reasons why I believe certain strands of 20th century liberation theology became overly optimistic. Their moral passion was entirely justified. Their commitment to justice remains deeply inspiring, but some assumed that once oppressive economic structures disappeared, a genuinely just society would naturally emerge. History has not confirmed that expectation. Consider the 20th century. Numerous revolutions promised equality. Many promised liberation from exploitation. Several promised entirely new societies built upon justice. Yet many eventually produced censorship, political repression, personality cults, economic collapse, or new forms of authoritarianism. The tragedy is not that these revolutions desired justice. The tragedy is that they underestimated the complexity of building a free society. Freedom it requires far more than good intention. It requires institutions. It requires accountability. It requires limits on power. It requires the culture that values truth. Most importantly, it requires humility. This brings us to one of the central themes of this chapter, utopianism. Human beings have always imagined perfect societies. Every civilization dreams of a future without injustice. Every generation hopes that perhaps it will finally build the ideal political order. There is something beautiful about that hope. Without hope, societies stagnate. Without vision, reform becomes impossible. Christianity itself is profoundly hopeful, but Christian hope differs fundamentally from political utopianism. Christian hope recognizes both greatness and the brokenness of the human condition. It believes transformation is possible, yet it also recognizes that every human institution remains imperfect because every institution is built by imperfect people. Political utopianism often forgets this second truth. It assumes that history itself can eventually eliminate moral failure once the right economic system exists, once the right political party governs, once the right ideology triumphs, then conflict would disappear, power would become harmless, justice would become permanent. History, however, consistently refuses to cooperate with such optimism. The more confidently human beings claim to possess the blueprint for a perfect society, the greater the temptation to silence anyone who questions that blueprint. If paradise is certain, then disagreement begins to look like sabotage. Criticism becomes betrayal. Opposition becomes counter revolution, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, liberation gives birth to another form of domination. It is here that I find the work of the philosopher Karl Popper particularly illuminating. Popper warned against what he called utopian social engineering, the belief that society can be completely redesigned according to a comprehensive ideological blueprint. His concern was not with reform itself. He strongly supported reform. His concern was with certainty. Human knowledge, Popper argued, is always incomplete, always fallible. We never possess enough knowledge to redesign an entirely new civilization with confidence. Consequently, political wisdom requires humility. It requires gradual reform. It requires constant correction. It requires the willingness to admit mistakes. This insight resonates deeply with my own philosophical framework of critical synthetic realism. If our knowledge remains fallible, then our political projects must also remain open to correction. That is why liberative realism rejects both passive acceptance of injustice and revolutionary absolutism. It seeks transformation, but it seeks transformation through responsibility, institutional development, epistemic humility, and moral accountability. In other words, liberation must remain courageous, but it must also remain realistic. As we bring this discussion to a close, let me emphasize that I believe let me emphasize what I believe is the central contribution of this chapter. The question is not whether we should seek liberation. The answer to that question is an unequivocally yes. When human beings are denied their God given dignity, Christians have both a moral and a theological responsibility to stand alongside the oppressed. The God of the Exodus remains the God who hears the cry of those who suffer. Jesus himself announced good news to the poor, freedom for the captives, and liberty for the oppressed. Liberation is not an optional concern of the gospel, it belongs to its very heart. The real question is different. How do we pursue liberation without becoming what we oppose? That is the question history repeatedly places before us. Every generation believes it can avoid the mistakes of the previous one. Every revolution believes it will be different. Every movement believes that because its cause is just, its exercise of power will also remain just. Yet history continually reminds us that moral certainty is not enough. Justice requires wisdom, freedom requires discipline, power requires accountability. This is precisely where realism seeks to make its contribution. Liberative realism does not ask us to abandon the struggle for justice, neither does it ask us to settle for the status quo. Instead, it asks us to rethink what genuine liberation actually requires. Liberation is not merely the destruction of unjust structures, it is the construction of just ones. It is one thing to overthrow tyranny, it is another thing entirely to establish institutions capable of protecting liberty after tyranny has fallen. That work is slower, less dramatic, often less celebrated, yet it is ultimately the more important task. History reminds us that revolutions No, history remembers revolutions. Civilizations are sustained by institutions. That is why I argue throughout this book that institution building is itself an act of liberation. Independent courts are instruments of liberation. An honest press is an instrument of liberation. Universities committed to truth are instruments of liberation. Churches that refuse to become servants of political power are instruments of liberation. Transparent elections are instruments of liberation. Professional civil service are instruments of liberation. Strong families are instruments of liberation. Even the ordinary virtue of honesty, responsibility, humility, forgiveness, and civil friendship becomes indispensable foundations of a free society. Freedom cannot survive without moral character. This is where Christian theology has something unique to contribute. Politics can distribute power, economics can distribute resources, law can establish procedures, but none of these can by themselves transform the human heart. That remains the work of moral formation. That remains the work of faith. The Christian tradition has always understood that lasting political renewal requires personal renewal. St. Augustine understood it. St. Thomas Aquinas understood it. The great social teachings of the Catholic Church understand it. Political systems matter, economic systems matter, institutions matter, but beneath them all lies the human person. If the hearts if hearts remain captive to pride, greed, hatred, revenge, and the desire to dominate, no constitutional arrangement will permanently secure justice. Sooner or later, corruption returns. This is why I insist throughout this book that liberation must be grounded in truth. Truth about society, truth about power, but also truth about ourselves. One of the most dangerous illusions in political life is the belief that evil exists only in our opponents. The Christian understanding of sin challenges that illusion. Every one of us remains capable of abusing power. Every movement must therefore create structures that restrain its own leaders. Every government must remain accountable. Every institution must remain open to criticism. Every society must preserve the freedom to question itself. That is not weakness, that is wisdom. Within my own philosophical framework of critical synthetic realism, this becomes an epistemological principle. Because human knowledge is always partial, political systems must remain corrigible. They must be capable of learning. They must be capable of admitting mistakes. They must be capable of reform. No ideology possesses complete knowledge. No government possesses complete wisdom. No revolution represents the final stage of history. Only God possesses perfect knowledge. Only God possesses perfect justice. Only God possesses absolute authority. Everything else remains provisional. Everything else remains accountable. This understanding produces a different vision of political responsibility. Instead of asking, how do we create a perfect society? Liberative realism asks, how do we create institutions capable of continuously correcting injustice? Instead of pursuing perfection, we pursue responsibility. Instead of promising paradise, we cultivate accountability. Instead of seeking absolute certainty, we practice epistemic humility. Instead of concentrating power, we distribute it through institutions that protect human dignity. I believe this represents one of the most important shifts needed within contemporary political theology. The church should never abandon its prophetic voice. It must continue defending the poor. It must continue exposing injustice. It must continue challenging oppression when ever it appears, but it must also become a school of responsible freedom. It must help societies cultivate citizens who understand that liberty is not sustained by slogans but by virtue, not by anger but by wisdom, not merely by resistance but by reconstruction. Ultimately, liberation is not an event, it is a discipline. It is a lifelong work of building societies where truth can flourish, justice can endure, institutions can remain accountable, and every human being can live in the dignity bestowed by God. And that, I believe, is the deeper meaning of Christian freedom. And that is the vision towards liberative realism. Thank you for joining me for this episode 6 of Faith, Power, and Emancipation. In our next episode, we turn to chapter 6, False Peace, Ideology, and Prophetic Disruption. If you found today's discussions helpful, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who are interested in theology, philosophy, justice, and the future of Christian thought. Your support helps this channel reach a wider audience. If you would like to explore the ideas in much greater depth, I invite you to purchase Faith, Power, and Emancipation through Amazon or my website, asongubooks.com, where you will find my latest books articles, podcasts, and other scholarly resources. Until next time, may God bless you. May He deepen your love for truth, strengthen your commitment to justice, and guide us all towards authentic human flourishing. Thanks.